Around Christmas time, you hear a lot about sugar plums, visions of sugar plums dancing in children's heads, the sugar plum fairy from the Nutcracker. But what exactly is a sugar plum? Because they don't have anything to do with plums. So to answer the question, what are sugar plums, I've decided to spend an entire weekend making a Victorian recipe for cherry sugar plums. So thank you to DoorDash for sponsoring this video as we endeavor to figure out what the heck sugar plums are. This time on Tasting History. If you go online and look up recipes for sugar plums, you're probably going to find some recipes that have plums and nuts and other fruit kind of all mashed together and then coated with sugar. And they are delicious, but they're not sugar plums. Now, there are some historic recipes that have plums with sugar going back to the Tudor era, but again, they're not sugar plums, they're preserved plums. No, the term sugar plums refers to something that has been coated in layer upon layer upon layer of sugar, and what's inside can be an assortment of different things, but it's never plums. And there are very few recipes from the period, the 18th and 19th century when they were popular, for something called sugar plums, and partly that's because they were made by professional confectioners, candy makers, who weren't sharing their recipes with the public, and partly it's because nobody in their right mind would make these at home because they are a lot of work. But guess what? I am not in my right mind. So I got this book, The Art of Confectionery from 1865, and it actually has many recipes for different sugar plums. It has cinnamon sugar plums, liqueur sugar plums, anise seed sugar plums, mint sugar plums, and a half dozen others. And while there is no recipe for a plum sugar plum, there is a recipe for an apricot sugar plum, but it doesn't actually use the fruit, it just uses the pit, which has to be soaked in different liqueurs to give it flavor, and it takes several months to make. In fact, most of them take several months to make, and I'm not going to do that, so I am going to make one that only takes days to make, and that's the recipe for cherry sugar plums. Set preserved cherries on a sieve in the stove. When they are partly dry, mix them with pounded sugar and rub them over a sieve. Dry them again and proceed as with barberry sugar plums. Then we look at the recipe for barberry sugar plums, which adds a few more steps, and one of those steps is to do as you would for sugared almonds, and then you look at the recipe for sugared almonds, and it's very, very long, it's several pages. But essentially, it describes a process of coating almonds, in this case, with layer upon layer of gum arabic and sugar, but it's the machine that they were using to actually make these coatings that's interesting. It says confectioners use a broad, shallow copper basin polished on the inside and kept in constant motion by machinery or by the workmen. And I don't have a team of workmen in my kitchen, so I'm using machinery. And luckily, I have a KitchenAid stand mixer that is fitted out with a panning attachment, to which I'll put a link in the description if you want to get one. So to get started, what we need are preserved cherries. So first, rinse the cherries under some water to get off as much syrup as possible, and then spread them out onto a pan and select only the ones that aren't broken or smushed. Then set the pan in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit or 95 Celsius for about 3 hours. You'll notice that I also tried making some of these with hazelnuts, but I'm going to follow the cherry ones in the video. After 3 hours, they should be fairly dry, but still probably a little sticky. But at this point, you're going to put them into a sieve and coat them with confectioner's sugar, that is powdered sugar with a bit of starch added. Once the cherries are coated in the sugar, then set them back onto the tray and put them back in the oven for another 2 hours. Then we're going to prepare our first layer of gum arabic, and this is a cold layer of gum arabic, and it's important to get this layer on there, especially if you're using something like nuts, because it is going to provide a barrier between the core and the successive layers of sugar, and it's what's going to let that sugar really adhere to the core. So to make the gum arabic, you mix 4 tablespoons of gum arabic powder with 4 tablespoons of warm water. Then whisk. Gum arabic is quite hard to dissolve, but if you keep whisking, it eventually will become smooth. Then take a couple of tablespoons of that gum arabic and mix it with a couple tablespoons of sugar and mix until the sugar is dissolved. Later on, it'll be sugar syrup that we mix in with it, but this first one specifies that it is cold with regular sugar. Once the mixture is ready, take the cherries out of the oven and put a few into the panning machine. Turn it on the lowest speed, and as the cherries tumble, add a small amount of that gum arabic sugar mixture. It really doesn't take very much, and you want to have a thin stream that you drizzle back and forth over the cherries. Don't just put a big glob in there. Now they will stick to the sides of the pan, so gently dislodge them with a spatula when they do, and then continue to tumble until the gum mixture is fully dried. It should take about 10 to 15 minutes. Once they're dried and just a little bit sticky, we're going to once again coat them in the confectioner sugar, followed by another coating of gum arabic. This time you'll note that they do not stick to the pan quite as much. Once they're fully dried, give them a third coating of powdered sugar, then set them on the baking sheet and back in the oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 2 hours, then turn off the oven and leave them to sit overnight, or for at least 8 hours. Now at this point in the process, you're probably asking, why am I doing this to myself? And it's a good question. You'll also probably look around and realize that your kitchen is an absolute wreck. I'll explain the hairdryer in a bit. And after all day in the kitchen, with it looking like it does, you're not going to want to cook dinner. Luckily, it is DoorDash to the rescue. DoorDash is a food delivery app that I use rather often, at least once a week, just like the other night when I was standing there with a hairdryer in my kitchen because I couldn't leave the kitchen. So I ordered from my favorite local Mexican restaurant and had food delivered through DoorDash. And it's not just delivery from restaurants. You can get flowers, electronics, and different ingredients from grocery stores as well. And I can't tell you how many times I have been in the middle of cooking something for the show and realized that I forgot an ingredient or 5 ingredients. And it's like I'm working on a sauce, so I can't leave the kitchen, otherwise it'll be ruined. So I can get those ingredients and have them delivered through DoorDash. Lifesaver. So if you want to make your life a little easier, then DoorDash is your door to more. Just download the DoorDash app now to get almost anything delivered. And use code TASTINGHISTORY2024 to get 50% off up to $10 on your first order of $15 or more. And now, with our bellies full and hopefully you've had a good night's rest, it's time for day 2 of making sugar plums. So after the cherries have dried overnight, they should have formed a sort of sugary crust over them. This texture will allow the supersaturated sugar solution to adhere to the sugar plums more easily. Easier than saying supersaturated sugar solution, I can promise you that. It's essentially a mixture of 1 part water to 3 parts sugar plus the addition of flavoring. And the book says that you can add all these different flavors. The most common, though, are vanilla, orange blossom water, or rose water. If you're going to do rose water or orange blossom water, 2 tablespoons is probably going to be enough. If you're doing vanilla, I'd say 1. So add the flavoring to 1 cup of water, then bring this to a gentle boil and add 1 cup of sugar, quickly stirring it in to dissolve, and then once dissolved, add a 2nd cup and stir, and finally a 3rd cup. Then let it slowly heat up undisturbed over medium heat, and it's best to use a thermometer for this part, as we want to wait until it reaches between 225 degrees Fahrenheit and 230 degrees Fahrenheit, or 107 and 110 Celsius respectively. This will happen shortly after the sugar boils up and then comes back down. Once it hits the temperature, take it off the heat and let it start to cool down between 170 degrees Fahrenheit and 190 Fahrenheit. So it's nice if you have like a hot plate or something that you can keep that temperature zone. But once it's ready to use, set a handful of cherries in the panning machine, turn it on, and drizzle a spoonful of the sugar syrup over the cherries. Then let them tumble until they are dry. And each layer takes about 10 to 12 minutes to completely dry before you can add the next. So that's a long time, and now you'll see why I was holding a hairdryer, because if you use a hairdryer to help dry them, it takes like 1 to 2 minutes. Now as you repeat this layering process, the sugar will begin to crystallize and turn white, and they will start to get bigger and stop sticking together as much. One way to stop so much sticking is to just use a little bit of sugar. It really doesn't take that much to coat them. I learned exactly how much to use through a lot of trial and error. My whole weekend was a lot of trial and error and swearing. There was a fair amount of swearing. It was a long weekend. Luckily, I had a nice smooth sugar plum with only a tiny hole where the pit was taken out of the cherry. And that is the end of day 2. So now the sugar plums need to sit for at least 12 to 24 hours to fully dry and harden before we move on to day 3. And now it's day 3. And now we're just going to be adding some color to these puppies. So to do this, make the sugar syrup just like you did on day 2, except you don't add any flavoring. Then in a separate pot, heat up 1 cup of water, and once it starts to steam, add an entire cup of the gum arabic, and then whisk. And it will take a while for the gum to dissolve, but as it heats, it should do so. Once dissolved, pour in the sugar syrup and let it heat. Again, we're looking to reach that 225 Fahrenheit mark. This is also about the time that I remembered how much the sugar syrup expanded as it got hot, and so I quickly had to switch the syrup to another pot that could hold it. Kind of dangerous. Probably shouldn't have done that, but I'm sure glad that I did because the sugar would have definitely boiled over. Then once the mixture hits 225 degrees, turn off the heat and let it cool down to 170. And at 170 Fahrenheit, you can add your coloring. But if you want multiple colors, like I did, then ladle a couple ladlefuls of the sugar syrup out into a separate dish and then add the coloring to that. Then repeat the process of drizzling the sugar over the sugar plums just like on day 2. 5 to 7 layers should be enough to give you some good color. I did 4 or 5 colors. I even made some purple just so they would look a bit more like plums, because there are no actual plums in sugar plums. But if that's the case, then where did they get that name? The term sugar plum came into use at least by the early 1600s, probably before, and its first written use is pretty interesting. It comes from a book by Thomas Dekker, written in 1608, which details the scams and doings of the criminal types in England at the time, and in the context of the book, the term sugar plums didn't refer directly to the candy, but rather was used as a metaphor for sweet words. Essentially, a constable stops a prostitute on the street, and she sweet talks him. And thus, by stopping the constable's mouth with sugar plums, that's to say, whilst she poisons him with sweet words, the punk vanisheth. And yes, at this time, the term punk referred to a prostitute. But this use lets us know that at least by this time, sugar plums were talking about some sort of candy. And the type of candy was typically layers of sugar surrounding a seed or a bit of spice like aniseed, caraway, coriander, or even a shard of cinnamon. And while the term sugar plum may have been fairly new, the candies were absolutely not. In medieval France, they were called dragées or confits. Dragées, later dragées, would come to refer mostly to nuts coated with sugar, think of the Jordan almond, while the spices were called confit or comfit in English. In Italy, this was called confetti, and in Japan, it's competo, and those were actually brought over by the Portuguese back in the 16th century. Comfits would have been present on any wealthy dinner table in the late medieval period or in Renaissance in Europe, and they were there to help sweeten one's breath or to help aid in digestion, kind of like Tums. Basically, Tums are the modern version of a comfit. Now, exactly why some of these comfits ended up becoming called sugar plums is unclear. Nobody wrote down, today we have started calling these things sugar plums. But at the time, the term plum could refer to many things other than just an actual plum. It could refer to any small piece of dried fruit like raisins or Zante currants, both being the plums added to plum pudding. And the term could also refer to just anything that was good or kind of rich. Like you could have a plum job that was a really good paying job, or you could be plum rich, just really wealthy, I guess. What is clear is that soon after the word sugar plum started being used to refer to these comfits, it was co-opted by the medical industry. In 1715, there was a mention of purging sugar plums entirely without mercury. So often mentioned in the public prints and used now for several years in great numbers of families, with such great success and liking, not to be distinguished by any mortal living from common sugar plums bought at the confectioner. Only those at the confectioner's are quite round, whereas these are made something flattish. And what precisely did these flattish sugar plums do? Well, they kill, destroy, and bring away all sorts of worms, with the slimy, corrupted matter that breeds them, having brought away from several men, women, and children great knots of such worms as these. On Christmas Eve, 1714, 2 of these plums brought away alive near half a pint of these sort of worms, from the child of Mr. Dixon, a tailor, in Feathers Court in St. Martin's Lane. Can you imagine someone publishing the fact that you had worms? And not only that, but letting people know your father's name, occupation, and address? Seems unnecessary. Anyway, if you look at the newspapers of the 18th century, you will find many references to these worm-purging sugar plums. And they were made this way so children might be deceived by eating a sweet sugar plum when they will take no manner of physic. That is to say, if your kid will not take his medicine, just wrap it in a bunch of sugar and he won't know the difference. It's kind of the same way that people get dogs to take a pill, I guess. But even though these sugar plums were very popular for their use, These were not the sugar plums that people were looking for when they went to the confectioner. Nor were the sugar plums used by the British military's 32-pounder cannons, but the fact that they sometimes called these cannonballs sugar plums can at least let us know the shape of the candy was often round. A fact made evident by this image of a British officer eating sugar plums. It also shows how they were sold at the time, and that was in a paper cone. The officers of the Corps were invited to play at marbles with His Honor, and all the common men had a paper of sugar plums. Sugar plums remained popular well into the 19th century, and in 1840 there was actually a poem written called Sugar Plums, and it gives some insight to what they were and what they weren't. The sugar plum. Comfit my mouth, and I in thy sweet praise will try my hand at feet, with anxious aim to make the meter meet, till Arabic or any other different sort of gum shall water for a sugar plum. Muse, if thy musings can prevail, I'll at it tooth and nail. I have no nerves of taste for syrups, jellies, or preserves. Oh, let them go to pot, may I, as so much worthless scum. They cannot make a sugar plum. Plums from the tree I do not find so plummy to my mind. Orleans or egg unnoticed for my patronage may beg, and damsons may be damned. Ah, I am in a passion, I say, mum, I'll swear not for a sugar plum. I love how clearly the newspaper wasn't allowed to print the word damned. How scandalous. Now, it was around this time that the author Sir Walter Scott gives us a hint that sugar plums also referred to sugar-covered nuts, known in French as dragées and in Italian as confetti. In Italy, a specific type of confetti made with almonds were thrown during weddings and during carnival, and instead of calling them confetti, Scott refers to them as sugar plums when he wrote compliments flew about like sugar plums at an Italian carnival. While they called them sugar plums in English, in French, it seemed that dragée stuck around and was the catch-all for any of these types of candies, as since the original French name of the sugar plum fairy in Tchaikovsky's Nutcracker Ballet, which premiered in 1892, was La Fée Dragée. Now, this probably most famous mention of sugar plums in the Nutcracker was actually based on the 1816 book by a Prussian author, E.T.A. Hoffmann, and a retelling by Alexander Dumas, though neither mention a sugar plum fairy. Though Hoffmann does mention something called a Zuckererbsen, which is a sugar pea. And since in the scene that he mentions this, he's talking about all these other kinds of candies, I'm assuming that at the time, Zuckererbsen didn't refer to a vegetable, but to a candy. And this was made evident when the English translation came out and they translated Zuckererbsen to sugar plum. But again, it wasn't a sugar plum fairy, rather these sugar plums were used as artillery. During the Nutcracker's battle with the Mouse King, the Nutcracker army advances, and before them went Fred's cannon rattling along, surrounded by cannoneers. And soon, boom, boom it went, and Maria could see how the mice suffered by the fire, how the sugar plums plunged into their dark, heavy mass, covering them with white powder, and throwing them more than once into shameful disorder. Now, while the Nutcracker does give us a connection between sugar plums and Christmas, I think the connection was even more evident in the 1823 poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, more often called 'Twas the Night Before Christmas, by Clement Clarke Moore. He's often credited with giving us much of our current concept of what Santa Claus looks like, and he was the first to name St. Nick's 8 reindeer. Not Rudolph, he came later. But it's in this poem that we first hear of when the children were nestled all snug in their beds, while visions of sugar plums danced in their heads. And those sugar plums were probably very much like the ones that I've spent the last 3 days making. And here we are, Victorian cherry sugar plums ready for Christmas. So here's the thing, they are lovely colored, but they are not polished. There are recipes to polish them in here using starch and everything, but I tried it, I couldn't get it to work. Today, they usually polish things, so here's a Jordan almond, which is essentially a sugar plum. I also have ones here made with pine nuts, and they are shiny, like an M&M, which is essentially a modern-day sugar plum. They often use different shellac and other things to give these smooth, shiny polish. They didn't use that back in the day, so they probably, even when they were polished, were never as shiny as the modern ones. Anyway, let's give it a try. I'll go with green. It's quite hard. That sugar, you're getting the orange. You get a little bit of the cherry, What's crazy is it feels like there's not much cherry left. A hint, but it's mostly sugar, and that's kind of what it's supposed to be. But I also made some with hazelnuts, so I'm gonna try that. They're much smaller. It's more like a Jordan almond. Has less layers of the sugar. Yeah, you get more of the hazelnut flavor. I really, really like that. Anyway, delicious. Are they worth the work? No, they are not. Go get yourself some Jordan almonds. Go get yourself some of these pine nut covered things. What's cool is these are actually made pretty much the same way that they were in this cookbook, because the only ingredients are sugar, pine nuts, and gum arabic. So made the same way, which is pretty cool. Honestly, there are modern versions of sugar plums still out there. We just don't call them sugar plums. And what we do call sugar plums now aren't sugar plums. I mean, I guess if you want it to be a sugar plum, it is, because that's how language works, but they're not what Victorians would have called sugar plums. That said, if you want to make one of those modern versions of sugar plums, Alton Brown has a really good recipe. Just Google Alton Brown sugar plums. I haven't made them, but they look really good, and they only take like 45 minutes to make, I think. And they include plums. So I'll probably do those for Christmas, because I'm not gonna make any more of these. Also, two things. One, don't forget the Tasting History Cookbook, since we're buying our holiday gifts. It makes an excellent gift. But two, I just had a TV show come out. A year and a half ago, I was asked to be on a competition show as a judge, and it's called Clash of the Cookbooks. It's on Roku, so if you have access to Roku, go watch it. So have a Merry, Merry Christmas, a Happy Holidays, and I will see you next time on Tasting History.